All right, so welcome, Halie. You're on Recovery Captured. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to have you on. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Yeah, how are you?
Thank you for asking. I'm doing really good, actually. And sometimes it's not easy to say that, and sometimes it's just graze the surface kind of question, just to like be polite and then go on with your day. But genuinely, I'm actually doing really well. So thank you.
Yes, that's awesome. I relate to that so much. The kind of like, oh, actually, I'm doing really well. And that feels weird to say, but I think I think that's good. I think it's important to celebrate those moments when they're authentic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Halie, give me the goods. What are you in recovery for? What is your recovery date? And a fun fact.
Okay. So my recovery date is February 1st, 2015.
Mhm.
And I'm in recovery. I mean, so many things, but alcohol and drug addiction primarily, codependence also, disordered eating. I mean, gosh, I'm in recovery from like capitalism. I mean, so so many things, but yeah, we'll stick with those things. And a fun fact about me. This question, I'm always like, oh God, fun fact about me. I guess a fun fact. Well, it's not that fun. I grew up in California, and people will always ask me if I'm anywhere else other than California, like, oh, do you know how to surf? I'm like, no, I have no idea how to surf. That's what comes up. I don't know if that's a fun fact or not. There you go.
Oh, it is. It is. I live in Vermont, and the number one question is, do you ski? Like, I try to snowboard. I'm not good at it, but that's a generic question. I feel like it's with your wherever you are, there's some sort of question. It's either that or cow tipping. Who knows?
Can you count it?
No, I've actually never done that.
That's nice. That's probably good for the cows. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll tip the waitress before I go tip cows, but you know. So give us a little background because you're primarily in recovery for your drug addiction. That's what the February 1st date is, correct? So let's get to the beginning of that, kind of what it was like, what happened, and where we're at now. We'll recap that, and then we'll get into some other goodies.
Sounds great.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just start from the beginning. I grew up in an alcoholic home, and so drinking to me was just a part of how everybody operated, really. I can remember from a really young age that was just something that people did under any circumstance, happy, sad, celebrating, angry. Right. That was kind of the go-to way of coping with feelings. And so when I was 15, I took my first drink with friends, and I remember just loving it. I loved it. And I remember too that one of the main reasons that I loved it is that for the first time it quelled the noise inside my head and in my body, right? I was a really sensitive kid, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I was also highly anxious. And I was really uncomfortable in my skin. I was really insecure. I didn't have a lot of sense of self. And there was a lot of kind of habit of let's present a certain way on the outside and make sure that people think that all is well, even if it's not. A lot of the kind of culture that we lived in. And so I learned how to do that. I learned how to be how people needed me to be liked, to be accepted. And I don't think that's just I think family dynamics certainly contribute to that. And I think that's also very cultural, right? And so I was also just a part of that culture, is like, let's present a certain way, regardless of how you're feeling on the inside. So there was always this kind of dissonance, this lack of authenticity, that only really fed the inner suffering that I had, right? Because it was like, oh, let's not address that. Let's just pretend that it's not there. And so then alcohol and drugs became a massive way for me to get to pretend that it wasn't there. And so I, pretty quickly started drinking very alcoholically. Like I remember, it would be like a Tuesday night, and I was 15, and I would be like stealing my parents' alcohol and getting wasted and blacking out before I went to bed, and then went to school the next morning. Like that's a lot, that's pretty intense. But I hid it for a long time, and I was actually pretty high functioning for a period of time. And so, I continued to drink. I started doing all kinds of drugs. And I grew up in a suburban town where, kids were pretty bored. And so I think for most people at first, they didn't really think that much of it. It was like, oh, we're just partying, but for me, it was a way to manage the suffering and discomfort that I experienced on the inside. And of course, I understand that now, all in retrospect. In the moment, I didn't really get it. I didn't think that I was drinking alcoholically. I just thought that I was being a normal teenager. And so that continued on for a while, it continued on for many years, but it continued in the way that I didn't recognize it as a problem until I was probably about, 21, 22. I managed to be pretty high functioning. I think I mentioned that. I went to college, I graduated from college, I had jobs, I did stuff. And so I think that also kept me in my dis-ease for a long period of time, because I could kind of get away with it, right? Like people were like, oh, you're living your life. I didn't need to address it because on the outside things looked fine. I wasn't having a lot of consequences.
Right. Everything lined up. Didn't, well, if I can hold a job, if I can graduate, I don't have a problem. You don't see it like that.
Totally.
Right.
So I did all those things, graduated, kept my jobs. And then I had kind of gone back and forth. I'll just keep this part brief, but back and forth between California and New York. I started school in New York, transferred back to school in California, graduated, went back to New York. So I kind of did this across the country thing. And in that period of time, I was doing things like taking 150 milligrams of Adderall a day, and then taking a bunch of Xanax to calm down from the Adderall. And then heroin got introduced into my regime, my drug regime. And that was the point at which I stopped being able to hide it. I stopped being able to get away with what I was doing, and I started to have a lot of really intense consequences. I was, overdosing. I was working in the art world in New York, and I would, not show up to my job, and where I would be so late because I was waiting for my drug dealer, and then I'd be nodding out at my desk, and oddly enough, I look back on that time, and I thought that I was hiding it well. I feel like that's such an alcoholic thing, right? Like we think that we're hiding it so much better than we are.
You think we're good liars.
Totally. Yeah. Everyone around us knows, and we're the last ones in a way to know, which is like so funny. But anyway, so eventually I got fired, of course, and by this time I actually had already been in 2 outpatient rehabs. I wasn't really willing to do inpatient because I didn't want to stop my life, which is kind of funny because I wasn't having much of one anyway, and in the short term, like it would have probably served me so much better, but I didn't want to go to an inpatient, so I went to outpatient rehabs. I also was trying to go to a methadone clinic to get clean. I was trying. There was a part of me that wanted to be sober, but there was a larger part of me that to just still wasn't ready, to be honest. And I was going for other people, because it started to get to a point where obviously like my close friends knew, eventually my family knew, and everybody wanted me to get sober. And, I've been sober for long enough now, and I've participate in 12-step programs and this kind of thing. And so I've heard a lot of different stories from people, and some people initially do get sober for other people and then for themselves, and that works, and that's beautiful. That wasn't my experience. It wasn't until I really wanted to get sober for me that I was actually able to stay sober. And so yeah, I lost my job in New York, eventually lost unemployment, lost my home, had to move back to California. I tried a third rehab. I remember going into that meeting at that outpatient, a group, and I'll just never forget it. It stands out so clearly in my mind. But we were going around the room, and all we had to do was say how long we've been sober and how we were feeling. And as it got closer and closer to me, I just became progressively more and more anxious. The idea of sharing what was actually happening inside of me in front of a room full of people felt so inconceivable to me. Like I just could not hang. Mm-hmm. And so I remember I got up, I went downstairs to smoke a cigarette, and I remember thinking to myself, like, I'll just smoke a cigarette and then I'll just go back up. But I just didn't go back up. I just left. And was like, I cannot do this. And then that was really kind of like the beginning of the end for me. I kept using, kept drinking. My drinking and using got worse. I ended up homeless in Oakland, in the Bay Area, and I would panhandle all day for drug money. And I was living in a van with these other two junkies, and that was just kind of what we did. They would go play their guitar in the BART station and busk, and I would go walk around on the streets and ask people for money. And I just had really kind of resolved to live that way forever, and really thought I was probably going to just live that way until I died. And to be honest, there was a period of time where I didn't really care. Like I was fine with that. I just wanted to be able to do my drugs and stay comfortable in that. And that was really it. And it wasn't until a friend of mine, who I had grown up with and used with, overdosed in front of me twice in 1 week, that something shifted in me. It was like something, whenever I talk about it as kind of like it's like it cracked open something in me, enough to kind of like, I don't know. It's like the visual that I have is like, it was like light started streaming into this crack, and something turned on in me, and I was like, oh, I actually don't want to die, and I actually desperately want to live, and I have no idea how. I have no idea how to live clean and sober. Mm-hmm. But I became desperate enough that I was willing to go to 12-step meetings. And really that's how I got sober the last time. And I've been so fortunate to have support and mentorship from other people in recovery. And I think that for me was really the shift. I had to become willing to receive that help though. That's the thing, right? Like at first, because when I went to other rehabs, other kinds of means of support, 12-step programs and things like that were always offered to me, but I had a lot of judgment around them. And, again, I've been sober for a long time now, and I feel I've seen a lot of people and heard a lot of experiences, and I by no means think that 12-step is the only path to recovery. I think there are many paths, and people find what works for them, and that's so beautiful. That's my experience, is that 12-step was really vital for me. And so I became willing to receive help. And prior to that, I didn't really know a lot of people who were sober. And so I think that was really difficult for me, because I just felt like such an outcast in a sense. And I felt like there was something deeply wrong with me, because everybody else around me seemed to be really normal. They could have 2 drinks and go home, and it wasn't a big deal. And I was like, how do people do that? I have no idea.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And so, I started to I was desperate enough to be willing to ask for help and to receive that help. I had to be willing to call people and to say, hey, I'm struggling right now and I need support. And that was so difficult for me at first because I had a lot of core beliefs about being a burden and frankly being unworthy of love and support. But I was more afraid of dying or winding up in jail than, and that fear became greater for me than the fear of reaching out and asking for help. Thank goodness it did, right? Because that really has changed my life. And so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the beginning of my recovery story. And there's so much more I'm sure that I could share, but I can sort of stop there and just check back in.
Yeah, well, you were just talking about the willingness. Like you have to be willing and open to start any kind of journey, I feel like, right? But for a newcomer, it's just like, okay, you have to do that. But like, how do I get to that point? How does that even happen? For me, I feel like it was like, there is no like pinpoint answer. It literally just happened for me.
Yeah.
I don't know why, and I don't know how. And when I first got sober, like you said, I had to do it for other people. I had an intervention and I had to do this. But then there was part of me that was like in the background, like, okay, maybe I do want to get sober, but I'm 21. So I don't know. Like, is this just a phase, right? I'm functioning. I can keep a job. I got a boyfriend. You know what I mean? Totally. But like when I walked into the rooms without even knowing what the hell 12-step was, I knew I had to be willing, open, and honest. And if not, I would die. I would go back to where I was, and I would let drugs take me.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate you speaking to the willingness piece and how it happened for you. And I think it's sort of similar for me. I can't pinpoint an exact moment, but what I also know is that for me, it was a moment to moment basis, right? Like I didn't feel just suddenly willing to do all of the things. I still had resistance, but something would occur or somebody would say to me, hey, do you want to go get coffee? And in that moment, it was like, I knew I had a choice. I could say yes and be willing, or I could say no. And it was like, I would just kind of check in with that and be like, okay, dang it, I don't want to do it, but I'm going to say yes, and so it was like moment to moment for me, that willingness. And then eventually my capacity for willingness just grew, right? Because I started to understand experientially that willingness actually made me more free, right? Because at first, when you're first getting sober and you don't really know how any of this works, you're like, but is willingness going to be safe, right? If I do the thing, is that actually going to help me, or is it just going to make me more uncomfortable? And then it was like I had to start learning step by step that actually every time I chose to be willing, something positive came from that, even if it didn't feel good, but it was like, oh, this is a teaching for me. And so then I started to trust the willingness a little more. And now I get to be in a place in my recovery where I know, like full bodied know that when I choose to be willing, something good comes from that. And so now it's much easier for me to be willing than it used to be,
Right. In the 12-step program, from where I'm coming from, they always said, never say no.
Totally.
When it comes to the program, there's obviously other times where we say no. We have to, right? We have to set that boundary. But within the program, you don't say no. Like you're walking, if you say no, you're walking away from an opportunity that could save your life. That can open up other doors, so making that choice, yes or no, to go out to coffee for fellowship, it's like, well, I gotta say yes. I was told I have to say yes, right? We gotta read in the beginning of our 12-step programs. You get handed the paper, you gotta read. You don't know, and it's like sponsorship. If you're able, willing,
totally. Yes.
Yes, for the mentorship, and you mentioned like it's not safe. Like, do we know if it's safe? right? We don't know. Like drugs and alcohol was what was safe. Our old behavior, our old mannerism, everything that was safe. Now you're telling me to let go of my coping mechanism and come into this world, as well as leaving this old behavior and literally starting fresh.
Yes.
I'm super vulnerable and you want me to keep going forward and say yes and be willing. Like, I can't, there's only so much I can take, right?
Totally.
But you gotta take it all.
Exactly. It's so, you're right. You're so right. It so feels that way. It's like you're being asked, you're like, oh, so not only am I being asked to stop doing drugs and drinking alcohol, but now I have to have a complete identity shift. Like, how? That's so scary. But that is what's being asked in a way. And honestly, thank goodness for that, right? I mean, I didn't have an identity that I really needed to hang on to when I was drinking and using anyway, but it's like, oh, that's all I know. And it's the unknown that's so terrifying. But I also appreciate you just speaking to the willingness and that kind of being a code in 12 step. And I will say that's something that I appreciate about 12 steps so much, because I can be such an overthinker and overanalyzer and ruminator, and I think that there's benefits to thinking things through and being thoughtful. Like there's a positive to that. And there's a way in which it becomes very negative and it's just like debilitating me. And that's something that I appreciate about 12 step, is that we do kind of have this code, this way of being that allows me to eliminate the need to overthink, right? Because it's like, oh, this is just what's suggested of me. I'm just going to do what's suggested. And like, because other people have done it, it seems like it worked for them. And I'm just going to trust that, because otherwise right now I'll probably go insane if I have too many options. So, yeah.
So with all, you touched on other things that you're in recovery for. How do you stay like well balanced? I've explained so many times that I'm a broken wagon wheel. Like here's my hub and my spokes are like, they're all different which way. So I'm just like thudding down the road, like I can't get the balance. I mean, luckily I got enough of it that I can, stay sober and stay healthy and, keep old behaviors out of the way. But it just sounds like you have such a like openness and this spirituality and just this energy that just radiates off of you. What else do you do to stay even ground, to not have a relapse or a slip, or backtrack on your disordered eating and other things like that? How do you keep it on track?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Also such a big question. There's so many things I could say. I'm just kind of checking in on which thread to pull. I think the first thing that comes up for me is that in my recovery, I've had to have a really massive paradigm shift around how I relate to myself. And what I mean by that is that when I first got sober, I think that I had a lot of internal messaging around it being selfish to choose myself and to take care of myself. And I could go into where that comes from. I don't know that that's necessarily important to this particular conversation, but all to say that what I had to relearn or remember is that actually choosing myself and choosing my self-care and filling my own cup is what allows me to be available to the people in my life, and what allows me to have the capacity to be of service in the way that I believe that I was put on this earth to be of service. And so I am just deeply committed to my personal growth, to my healing, to my recovery, to doing things every day to tend to my well-being. And I don't want to give any illusion that I do that perfectly by any means. Like I'm still very human, and I, have a 1-year-old, and I have days where my self-care is probably shit, or can I swear on this? Sorry.
Absolutely, please.
Okay. but I have a real baseline commitment to myself. And and that's because I have come to understand that when I am committed to myself and my growth and my care, that actually serves everybody, not just me. But it has definitely taken me some time to reorient to that as a reality. At first, when I actually the first like year of my recovery, I didn't have a problem being really committed to taking care of myself, because I was such a disaster and causing so much harm to the people in my life that everyone was like, please just take care of yourself, please, you know. But then once I kind of got better, I had to, then there's those kind of creeping thoughts of, oh no, I can't tend to myself, start to come back in, and I've had to really work on them. But so that's one thing. And then also, I think that part of it is taking things moment by moment, learning how to be present and pay attention, particularly to my body. I think that's been probably, I don't want to say the biggest, but one of the biggest components of my recovery process is that prior to recovery, you know, in addiction and alcoholism, for me, I was, and even before addiction, alcohol and drugs were in the picture, I was so disconnected from my body. And I think we're really taught that in so many ways. We're taught to override our body's wise knowing, to produce and to cater to other people at the expense of ourselves, and all of this kind of stuff. And so I started to do in my own recovery things like yoga, things like meditation, and I still, those are still foundational and have also evolved so much. And I've learned how to really connect to my body's messaging, so that on a moment to moment basis, I have the capacity to check in and be like, oh, does that actually, like someone asked me to do something, can I actually do that? Is that a yes in my body, or is that a no? And can I honor that? When I'm tired, can I allow myself to take 10 minutes to rest, or am I overriding that? But I've had to learn how to even recognize what my body is asking of me to begin with, because for so many years I didn't know how to do that. And so that's been a huge part of my process, but is now a part of, it's kind of, I'm super thankful that that feels pretty ingrained in me at this point, to be able to tune in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So those are two things that come to mind. I mean, there's so many more, but I have all kinds of support that I have. I still participate in 12-step programs. I do therapy, all kinds of different therapy. And most importantly, I've chosen to surround myself with people who are on a similar path and therefore hold me accountable on a day-to-day basis. And I've learned how to have a baseline of my own self-accountability, because recovery has granted me a life that I love, and I want to keep that life, you know? And I'm like, okay, if I'm going to keep this life, then there's things that I need to be always doing. Early in recovery, that kind of felt like a burden. Like I remember people would talk to me and be like, oh man, yeah, so, you know, this 12-step thing is for life, or this recovery thing is for life. And I'd be like, what? I thought I was gonna like come in here, have a couple months and like be cured and then just get to be done, right? And then and then I realized that wasn't true. And for a period of time, I was like, oh man, that sucks. But now I actually am so grateful for it, because I'm like, oh wow, because I choose recovery, that means I'm continuously growing and evolving as a person, and I get to only become more and more free. And what a gift that is. So yeah.
I like how you talked about finding yourself, becoming in tune, because I sure hell wasn't. I didn't know my needs. I didn't know how to take care of myself. You know, I was a people pleaser. I mean, I still am, but it's like I put people before me, right? I know your needs before you even know your needs. God knows what my needs are.
Yeah.
Right? But my first mentor, it just blows my mind still how in tune she was with her body. Like she had some medical issues and stuff, so she had diet restrictions. She's like, yeah, I have to have so much ginger, and I can't have, you know, stuff with seeds, or I can't have onions really upset my stomach, even garlic. I'm like, how do you fucking know this? Like, I know I'm allergic to beets because I had an allergic reaction. Other than that, like, I don't know. And so it always, it sparked something in me. And I was like, you have what I want, right? You have what I want. I want to know myself. I don't know shit about my cycle.
Yeah.
I don't know shit about food. I don't know what I can and cannot consume. I don't even know how to whatever,
Totally.
And so she taught me how to listen to myself, how to
Mhm.
figure out what my needs are, right? And then in turn, I was able to care for myself and then in turn find self-love, right?
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
self-love was it. I mean, even today, it can be so hard,
Totally.
but it's much easier. Like, I love myself. I can tell you that today, but there's some days that I get tripped up. I'm like, like could be a little better. But, like through learning about myself, I too was able to figure out how to love myself, you know?
Totally.
So
I so
yeah.
sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just, no, you're fine.
I so appreciate you speaking to that. I was just talking about this on Instagram the other day about the self-love piece because of course, when I first got sober, self-love was like the most elusive thing ever. I really only had self-hate. And so I'm like, I can't even imagine what self-love looks like. And I have felt many times so confused about what that even means. I mean, cultivating a feeling of love for self, yes, beautiful. And that felt so out of reach for a long time. But I appreciate you speaking to like, it's sort of like step-by-step self-care came first and then the self-love. And I feel similarly in that, for me, sometimes self-love actually looks like doing the things that feel hard. And I don't necessarily feel love in that moment, but I know that I'm taking an action that's moving me in the direction of having a loving relationship with myself. But I feel like that's such an important distinction because I feel like for so many people, they're like, yeah, what does that mean? I don't know that feeling. I haven't experienced that. And so how do you have it? And for me, it's sort of like we talk about this in 12 step, right? As a program of action. For me, self-love is action. And yes, if it can come with a feeling of love, like warm and fuzzy feeling, beautiful. But sometimes it doesn't, but you're still practicing self-love. You're doing the hard thing. You're setting that boundary. You're saying yes when you want to say no. Like those things to me, saying yes when you want to say no in a good way, not in like a betrayal of self kind of way, but those things to me are self-love in action, right? Because we're choosing ourselves at the end of the day, even if we're not necessarily feeling like, oh, I'm so warm and fuzzy, love myself in this moment,
Mm-hmm. Well, you're not going to grow when you're content, right? Like, what's going to motivate you, right? You're going to grow when you are in discomfort.
Totally.
You know what I mean? Like, that's what I've learned. Like, I have to put myself in an uncomfortable situation to be able to accept, allow, continue the situation, right? I hate big crowds. Going to a 12-step meeting, big crowd, hated it, but I had to go, right?
Totally.
So I continued every day to do that, and that made it much easier to go, right? I still do, but public speaking, getting up in front on the podium at a 12-step meeting, it's like, God, I hate this, but I'm going to do it. It's very uncomfortable, but now it's becoming a little more comfortable. You know what I mean? Like, we have to experience discomfort to have that growth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree fully. And like, look at us now, right? Like you have a podcast, like you're putting yourself out there in these really big ways. And I get to do the same thing in my work, and I feel so grateful for that because it's like, yeah, those little moments of willingness to do the uncomfortable thing serve us in ways that we may not even recognize they're going to serve us in the moment, but they solidify and strengthen the foundation that we get to like springboard off of into the most incredible growth that we could have never even conceived of prior to recovery. And it's so beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What is like your number one go-to self-care?
Great question. Honestly, I think for me right now, my greatest self-care is actually community care. It's like choosing to be in community, choosing to call my friend and ask how they're doing and let them see me for how I'm doing. And same with my partner. I'm super grateful and lucky that my partner's also in recovery, and so we just very much speak a similar language. And having those safe spaces where I get to be witnessed in an authentic way wherever I'm at are so supportive and healing and reparative. I think prior to recovery, such a big component of the way that I moved through the world was in deep, deep isolation. And that was both by choice and also sometimes not, but a lot by choice, and can still be something that I want to revert to when I'm uncomfortable or when I'm struggling. But what I've learned in recovery is that actually so much of my healing and I believe all of our healing happens in relationship, right? And that's what I think 12-step is beautiful for so many reasons, but I think that's a huge component of why is like we come into a space, we allow ourselves to be seen and loved for how and who we are in the moment, regardless of how effed up we think we are. And that helps to heal, And so for me, that's also a huge component of my self-care is actually being willing to be in community care and be held and supported by other people and receive that. Receiving is such a huge thing for me that was so hard for so long. Mm-hmm. And then just on a kind of more like truly like self and meaning not requiring other people necessarily care component, I would say it's I've been doing this practice that I actually learned from one of my teachers who I just love so much and has changed my life in so many ways, but she calls it a possibility practice. And basically it's it can I either draw or I write, but what I'm doing when I'm drawing and when I'm writing is I'm very intentionally cultivating a feeling in my body of how I want to feel. I think that, for so many, and I know for me, if I'm not paying attention to what's happening inside of me, my baseline way of operating is like from a place of anxiety or from a place of fear, right? And those things are evolutionarily wise mechanisms within us, but I think for most of us, they are just on overdrive. And a lot of times for me, if I really check in with my truth, the anxiety that I'm feeling is like pretty self-created and not necessary, sometimes it is, and so there's no shame around it, but a lot of times it's not. And so what the possibility of practice affords me is a capacity to reorient. So it's like, oh, okay, I'm noticing that a lot of anxiety is coming up for me right now. Is that real? Is it serving me? If it's not, how can I reorient? And how I reorient is through writing, drawing, and most importantly, as I'm doing that, I'm cultivating a feeling in me. I'm like, oh, I want to feel ease in this moment. I want to feel confidence in this moment. I want to feel compassion in this moment. How do I bring those words into my physical reality? I think we talk a lot about like intentions, having intentions, or even affirmations, right? Which in and of themselves, I don't think are bad. But I think that the missing piece a lot of times is that people will have an intention, but it's just words in our mind. But our feeling in our body is very different, right? But the feeling in our body is actually what's informing how we're moving through the world, right? So I can be like, okay, I'm peaceful, I'm peaceful, I'm peaceful, I'm peaceful, I'm peaceful. But if I'm really actually anxious, then the anxiety is what's guiding me, not peace. And so that's for me what the possibility practice is how do I orient to the feeling of peace and really bring that into my soma, into my body. And some days that feels very accessible to me. Luckily, because of recovery, I have a lot of experience of actually learning what peace feels like, right? Or ease feels like. Some days it doesn't feel as accessible, and that's okay, but I still practice anyway because it's like we're creating the new neural pathways, right? We're reorienting ourselves still. So that feels like a really big self-care practice that I do also.
I love it. And you wouldn't be able to do that if you didn't learn about yourself. right?
Totally.
It all
Exactly.
wraps together.
It all wraps together.
So you talked about the isolation, right? And one of your self-cares is putting yourself out in the community. One of the things that you wrote in your email to me was you used the word sisterhood. I love it. Like, give me more about that. Are we talking about just 12-step fellowship, or is there more connection? Is this something else that I don't know about?
Totally. Yes. 12-step connection is certainly a huge part of that. And then another big part of it is, well, gosh, okay. So two things that come to mind. One is that in January of this last year, I founded an online space for women in recovery called Embodied Recovery Community. And it's all centered around embodiment and what it means to be embodied as a human in recovery. And it's for people who identify as being in recovery from all kinds of things. So we have certainly substance abuse and alcoholism. We have codependency, we have disordered eating, we have love addiction, a lot of different recovery orientations. But we come together like 6 times a month. So we have weekly recovery yoga meetings where half of it is, movement and breath, half of it is a meeting. We have a ceremony that I facilitate every month, and then also a gathering that's called Collective Attunement, where we do an embodiment practice together. And then we also have pre-recorded embodiment practices, self-reflection journal prompts, all kinds of really fun stuff. But all to say that gathering in that space with these women, there are about 30 women in the program right now, and they're all so incredible, and I'm just continuously amazed by women, period. And that's also been such a huge shift for me in recovery. When I first got sober, I was terrified of women. I did not trust women or really like women. I only had guy friends.
I think we all can say that, because any female I talk to, they say the same thing.
Totally. And I think, I did actually, that's not true. I had female friends, and actually I've been gifted with beautiful female friends for a lot of my life, but very, very few. And most women I did not trust or like. And now I understand that a huge part of that is that I didn't trust or like myself. And then I kind of assumed that all other women were like untrustworthy like me, and so I've had to, as a product of my own inner work, and that's just shifted a lot. And then with 12 step, that shifted a lot. All to say that I love women now, and women are like my lifeblood and nourish me so deeply. And yes, that comes both in 12-step communities, that comes from embodied recovery community, and then also just comes from being out in the community where I live in Oregon, with women in general who are in, a lot of the women I'm in connection with in this particular community are, I know, either from kind of wellness communities, spiritual communities, things like that. But I have grown to feel like that is also such a huge part of what my recovery is being out in the world and being able to authentically be in relationship with other women and having a kind of intimacy with other women, right? Like, I always kept people very much at a distance, and you could only get to know me so much, because I just didn't feel safe a lot in relationship. And that still comes up for me sometimes. I have to really work on that. But I've also been, and I believe that because of my own kind of work and where I am in my life, I have become open enough that I can receive love and care from other women who are on a sort of similar path, whether that's recovery or elsewhere. And so, yeah. So I love, sisterhood, and feel like that's also how we're meant to be, right? We're not meant to be isolated in our little silos and not talking to anybody. Like, we're interdependent beings, and we need one another. And that's how we thrive. We don't thrive solo, right? I think we have this kind of cultural archetype of the lone wolf, like, oh, I'm a lone wolf, but the truth is that wolves only actually separate from their pack when they're going off to die. And so it's like, that's like the whole concept of lone wolf is like, I feel kind of misguided in a way. Like, we're pack animals, we need each other. And so that's been a huge part of how I live now, and always want to. And it's such a gift to get to live that way. To get to have other people to be mirrors for you, to be honest with you, to love you when you're having a hard time loving yourself, to inspire you, and then you get to inspire them. And it's like this, I always think of it as like an infinity sign, like you help them, they help you, we serve each other, we love each other. It's really, yeah. I can go on for days about it.
No, I love it because, like we both mentioned, we both hated girls. We both intimidated. We both had fear around them, right? I feel like that's a lot of women. So how do the newcomers coming in get to where you are? What were the steps that we have to take to get to that point? For me, 12 step was I give my world to 12 step because it saved me, right? And it was, for me, attending female only meetings.
Yeah.
That's how I had to start. And then I rebuilt the relationships that I had with females from elementary school, that I'm still friends with now. Like, I had to reintegrate them back into my life. I had to go to these 12 step meetings with just women. I had to go out and get coffee with these women. And I had, thereafter,
totally.
How do newcomers start? How did, how did you walk away from that to be where you are now?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I mean, I think it goes back to what we were talking about willingness, right? I just had to be willing step by step to show up and say yes to things. And, when I first started doing 12 step, I said yes to lots of different people. And, I'm not going to pretend, like, there were people that actually I didn't really jive with. I had to say yes to find out that I didn't jive with them, and that's okay. I don't think you need to become friends with every single woman that you meet in recovery or beyond. I think that that's also kind of a product of recovery, is that you start to learn and feel more clear on who and what is actually resonating for you, and being able to honor that. But yeah, I had to just say yes. And it was in those little, sometimes it would be something like, I would say yes to going to a meeting and then with one person, and then I would meet another person from that, or someone would introduce me to someone or something like that. And then that started to happen out in the other areas of my life, right? Like, I would go to a yoga class, and afterwards I'd be picking up my stuff, and there would be a woman standing next to me, and she would say hi, and I'd be like, oh, I'm going to introduce myself, and then I would start a conversation with her, or I would go to some event and be standing next to somebody and just introduce myself, and so it's like, I started just kind of being willing to put myself out there a little bit more, even though, and it felt uncomfortable, right? And that goes back to what we talked about, like, growth happens in discomfort. And so it actually almost in a way became this challenge to myself, where, and again, that was for me checking in with my body, where it's like, I would have a pull to say something to someone or to introduce myself. And then I would have a kind of contraction and be like, oh no, I can't do that. That's scary. And then that contraction, to me, it was an indicator of like, ooh, what if you challenged yourself in this moment? You don't want to, but you do want to. Why don't you follow the part of you that does want to and just do it and see what happens? And so that's kind of how it has been for me and continues to be. I mean, much less with COVID, but I still meet people all the time. And I just make an effort to put myself out there, even and maybe especially when it feels uncomfortable. And I think just by virtue of, I hear this a lot in recovery, is like, just keep showing up. You just keep showing up. You just keep showing up. That applies to 12 step. That applies to life, period. And I've learned that whenever I show up, a lot of times that's where it happens. That's where I meet somebody. And so I just keep showing up, keep showing up moment by moment.
You mentioned the lone wolf, and I never knew about that.
Yes.
By himself to die. I never knew that.
Yes.
So, totally. It hits differently for me. Totally. Like, I see it differently now. And now it's like, oh, okay. That's why, because we're pack animals. We need to be with each other. But you also talked about isolation, right? for me, I'm an introvert. I need myself by
Totally.
myself
Totally.
to, re-energize, to just, collect myself, right? How do we figure out isolation
Mm,
between self-care by ourselves? Like, I feel like there's a very thin line, very blurred line that could be crossed.
totally.
What
Totally.
what comes up for you with that?
Yeah, I really appreciate you speaking to that because it's the same for me. People perceive me as an extrovert, but I'm actually introverted for sure. I'm an introverted no, an extroverted introvert. I can be extroverted when I need to be, but I definitely need that solo time to recharge for sure, for sure. And for me, again, I will say it comes back to being connected to my body. Isolation for me feels like avoidance. I can tell I'm isolating because I feel avoidant. um, Self-care feels expansive to me. It feels like I'm moving into something that's needed. And so yeah, for me it's more the kind of sensation that I feel in my body. And it's not just sensation too, it's like thought patterns also, right? But it's like isolation is contraction for me. When I'm isolating, I know there's a part of me, if I'm getting really honest with myself, that knows that this isn't serving me, but I just feel afraid. I feel avoidant. I feel small. I feel insecure. I feel whatever those things are, and therefore don't want to participate in life. Um, Whereas self-care and tending to myself feels a lot more, yeah, open, expansive. I know in myself and have thought patterns around like, oh, I'm doing this thing and it's really serving me and it's also going to be serving other people and it feels good to me. Um, Isolation doesn't feel good to me. It just feels comfortable, if that makes sense.
It's
But
so
also increasingly in recovery, isolation feels more uncomfortable, right? Because I have grown to experience another way of being that isn't isolation, that's like being out in the world. And so it's shifted a little bit, but yeah, does that make sense?
It does. And I absolutely love the description that you gave with isolation. Like, you're all balled up, all tight, and then being by yourself for that self-care is more open. And
Yes.
it's so true. It's definitely like, it's on point of how I feel if I'm isolating versus just kicking it by myself.
Totally. Totally. Yeah, where you're like, I'm cooking it by myself and this feels great.
I do it all the time. I love it. I love being by myself. Well, before, it's like I could not stand myself. I could not stand being alone. I could not stand not moving around, right? I had to be going. And my first mentor, this lady is just brilliant. She brought so much to me.
Yes, thank God for good mentors, right?
For real. She's like, just sit with it. Take a minute. Take a breath.
Totally.
And I'm like, fuck, I need to go. She's like, no, we don't need that extra, like drama. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? Like, just slow down.
Totally.
Go, go, go.
Yes, yes. My first mentor was the same, thank goodness, also so connected to her body, and I learned so much from her. And she was similar to me. I remember in very early recovery, I had been diagnosed with depression and anxiety for a lot of my life, been on lots of different medications prior to recovery and stuff. And I was really afraid when I first got sober that I was gonna get depressed again, and I would think about that a lot. And I I will just share that my personal experience is that my depression, I can recognize now, was mostly alcohol and drug induced, rather than like a true kind of clinical depression. But I remember my sponsor would just be like, Halie, just trust trust how you're feeling. Because I slept a lot in early recovery. My body was just recovering from 10 years of substance abuse. And so I would sleep a lot and I'd be like, is this okay? Am I depressed? Is there something wrong with this? And she'd be like, hey, just trust your energy. She's like, if in 3 months you're still feeling this way, then we'll talk about it. But for now, just like, it's okay. Just trust your energy. If you need to sleep, just sleep. And that was so revolutionary to me, because I was like, oh, okay, I can just kind of trust my body and like try to relax and not overthink this. Crazy.
I know,
And sure
right?
enough, it was great. Yeah.
Right, exactly. It's, I'm going to sleep all day, every day because my body's recovering. I'm going to eat a pint of Ben and Jerry's every night because my body's recovering, like people.
Balance.
Exactly. Well, people are always like, oh, I gained all this weight. Oh, honey, you know how much weight I gained? I ate so much freaking ice cream in the beginning, but my body needed it. I needed it at that time. Yes, it's not the healthiest choice, but that's what I needed at that time.
Totally.
So in wrapping up, let's get to what we want. I mean, your whole message is just awesome. And so I don't know how to like pick one thing out, but what's one thing that you would want our listeners to take away with them today?
Great question. Funny, I ask this to people when I have these conversations, but nobody's ever asked me. What's one thing? Gosh, there's just so many things. It's really hard to pick one. Let me just check in here. I think if there was one to pick, there's two that's coming out, so I'm going to share two, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
The first is to be willing to ask for help. Just do it, even though you don't want to, even though it feels so scary and so vulnerable. Ask for help, because that's what changed everything for me, is that I became willing to ask for help and receive that help. And I couldn't get sober until I could do that, because I was trying to get sober solo, and you can't get sober solo. You can't recover solo. I think that's been a big message of what we talked about today. We need other people. So there's that. And then also too, just a kind of invitation to start to get curious about your body and remember how wise our bodies are, and that they're actually talking to us all the time, and we're just not necessarily paying attention. But for me, developing body curiosity over body control has also been a huge part of my recovery. And so just an invitation to people to start shifting that. Can we get curious about what's happening in our body versus trying to control it all the time? What does it look like to shift that relationship? So there's those two things I'll just stick with.
I love them. And Halie, last thing, give us a plug for you. Like, where can we find you? Any other things you want them to know,
Yes. Yeah, totally. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for asking. So I tend to use Instagram the most. You can find me on Halie Devlin, which is HALIE DEVLIN. And then also Embodied Recovery Community. It's a community for women at the moment, although the vision is that it will expand beyond that. But you can also find Embodied Recovery Community on Instagram at Embodied Recovery Community. And I love to talk to people about all things recovery. So DM me, all the things. I'm very available for those conversations. And thank you so much for having me on. It's been so great to connect with you.
Absolutely, Halie. Thank you so much for being on, and we'll chat soon.
Sounds great. Thanks, Shannon.